For the past year or so, I've been trying to limit my palette as much as possible, and this week I painted a Rhinoceros using only 2 colours. If you limit your palette down to 2 or 3 colours, it makes it easier to maintain colour harmony through your painting, and you don't have to worry about muddying your colours and creating a disjointed painting. Today I'll share a few things with you. I want to show you how I painted the grass at the front. I'll show you my progression through the painting and why I chose to paint all the creases and wrinkles on the skin towards the end of the painting. I used 2 watercolor pencils right at the end, so I'll show you that as well. The reason I used the pencils at the end was because I wanted to have a bit of a play. I used Fabriano Artistico soft press paper, and it's supposed to be a good paper to use pencil and ink on as well as watercolor paint. It's the first time I've used it, so I wanted to see what I could do with it. Soft press paper is in between cold press and hot press. Hot press paper is smooth and cold press paper has some texture to it. This soft press paper has got a slight tooth that I found really beautiful to paint on. Because the tooth is only slight, as I said, it allows the use of pencils and ink as well as watercolor. I found it easier to paint on than hot press paper. It felt like I was painting on beautiful, fine, smooth cloth, and I enjoyed painting on it, and I will buy it again. For paints, I mentioned I used only 2 colours. The 2 colours that you will always find on my palette, Burnt Sienna and French Ultramarine by Winsor & Newton. This is the reference photo that I used for this painting. It was taken by David Claude and I downloaded it from Unsplash website. I started by painting a light wash of burnt sienna down the bottom and some French ultramarine mixed with a small amount of burnt sienna for the sky. I painted that onto the wet paper and I wet the entire paper so that the paint would drift onto the rhino as well. Then I dropped some water droplets onto the burnt sienna area as it was drying so that I could create some watercolour blooms in that area. From there, I started to paint on some long grass with some masking fluid. I'm using a long liner brush and I'm painting long, thin strokes that all point towards the rhino's head. I'm also painting the masking fluid over the top of the legs and onto the head as well. When I finished that, I waited until it was dry and then I started to wet the grass area with some water. I take the water right up further than where I'll be putting the paint so that the paint won't have a chance to drift up to the edge of the water, causing a hard paint line where I don't want it. Now I'm going to use some more burnt sienna, but this time I'll use some more pigment. So this will be darker than that first wash that I painted on. And I paint that onto the wet paper down where the grass is. And that way you'll be able to see the grass once I remove the masking fluid. And I won't do that until the end of the painting. As it starts to dry, I drop some water droplets on again to create some watercolour blooms on those areas where it's looking a bit drier than other areas. Just there, it's starting to dry. I mixed some burnt sienna and French ultramarine together to make a grey that I could wash over the rhino. I wanted a cool grey, so I mixed more of the blue into the mixture. I also mixed some water into it because I didn't want this first layer of paint to be too dark. Just put a bit more blue in it. Then I used my large flat brush to wash that grey onto the Rhino. Try and work as quickly as I can before the paper starts to dry. And you can see how my paint is separated a little. Some areas you can see the French ultramarine, and that's quite okay, there's nothing wrong with that. The Rhino is still damp. I've got my large brush here. It's got a little bit of moisture in it, not a lot, and I'm taking some of the paint off on those lighter sections around the shadows. It's quite a bit lighter on the eye and around that large shadow that the ear creates. So I'm looking at the reference photo and I'm trying to remove some of those highlights. As long as I don't put any more water on the painting, so if my brush is drier than the painting, I should be right. If I put a brush that's too wet on there, I risk creating watercolour blooms where I don't want them. When I washed the legs in, I faded the colour off at the bottom so that the legs or feet would disappear into the grass. So along the bottom here, I soften away that edge. I want to start painting in the shadows, the cast shadows that are on the Rhino. So I'm going to mix some more grey up. Again, I use burnt sienna and French ultramarine mixed together. This time I want the colour to be darker than my first wash, so I need to use more pigment. Like the first wash, I want a cool grey again, so I need to use more of the blue than the burnt sienna. I keep mixing until I get a colour that I'm happy with. Then I used that colour to paint in all the cast shadows that I could see on the Rhino. I did that on dry paper. I'm painting the cast shadows on before I paint all the detail on, because the detailed creases will be quite dark, and dark paint tends to lift if you wash a colour over the top of it. So it's best to paint them in first, and then I'll put the darker creases over the top of the shadows. There, I've got all the cast shadows painted in now. This shadow here I painted on wet paper because it's got soft edges. Now I needed a really dark colour. So I mixed burnt sienna with French ultramarine again. I used freshly squeezed pigment so that I could keep the water out of it and the colour would be at its full intensity. So it's really thick and the puddle of paint won't move on the palette if I tilt it. And then I paint that onto the wet paper. Because the paint's fairly thick, it tends to sit where I put it, but because the paper is wet, I get that soft outer edge. Before I put the paint on, I wet the paper to the left of the pencil line, and that gives me that soft paint edge along here. I've just picked up a bit more paint there, just to deepen that colour right in the ear. So the paper's still damp. It's quite thick, dark, sticky pigment there. It's as dark as I can get it. Using my little zero brush, I'm going to start to paint in some of these creases. So this is on dry paper now. I've deliberately only drawn a few pencil lines to follow. The lines I've drawn in are mainly directional to make sure I get the direction right, But I think it will be better to paint a lot of these lines on freehand without trying to follow pencil lines. I think it will look more natural, less contrived. So I haven't drawn all of the lines on because I think it just gets too confusing and then you've got to try and paint over the pencil lines all the time. So I look carefully at the reference photo. I'm not going to follow it exactly, but I want to start off pretty close. And then once I've got the main lines in, I can start to add some of my own. And you can see I'm not rushing, taking my time, painting carefully. I'm going to vary the thickness of the strokes. So in some areas it will be thicker, that's where I push down on the brush. In other areas I'll have quite fine lines where I use the tip of the brush. All of these creases will be painted on dry paper. And the whole time I'm using the black mixture with my 0 brush. Just keeping an eye on the reference photo as I paint them in. They don't have to be exactly the same. I'm just trying to get the direction right. I think the hardest part of this is working out what I need and what I don't need. So I'm not going to paint everything that I see in. Moving on to the wrinkles around the eye now. Once I got a lot of them in place, I came back with some darker paint and painted over the top to darken some of them. And then I started to paint some little lines in between. The lines or creases took quite a while to paint in, but I took my time and I enjoyed the process of painting them in. To add some interest to the front of the painting, I used some burnt sienna to darken some of the areas where the grass crossed over one another. So I darkened those geometric shapes that were formed there. I did that in a few places at the front. When that was dry, I used my rubber cement pickup tool to remove the masking fluid. And that's all I did to create the grass at the front of the painting. Right at the end of the painting, I got out some watercolor pencils and I started to draw on a few highlights. These are Caran d'Ache Supracolor watercolor pencils. They're really soft. I used a white and a really pale blue and I drew on a few highlights in the dark areas. I didn't activate the watercolor pencil, I just left it dry. I also used my mechanical pencil to add a few more wrinkles and creases. The coloured pencil isn't really necessary, but as I said, I just wanted to have a play and see what the pencil was like on the paper. And so far I'm quite impressed with the paper. I think I will definitely buy it again. It's quite enjoyable to paint on. And as I mentioned earlier, I feel that it's easier to paint on than hot press paper. It's not as slippery as hot press paper. I found that it tends to be a bit more forgiving. This mechanical pencil is fairly inexpensive. It's an HB graphite that I'm using and I think the size is 0.7 millimeters or something. It's not very big. Back to my white pencil here. I've just run it down the edge of the ear there to bring that out a bit more. And now a bit more of the blue. I quite like the little blue accents here and there. white here on the ear. Adds a bit of texture. And then I draw around the pencil lines with my graphite. This shadow edge just here, I want to soften it slightly so that it's not such a hard, sharp line. So I've got my medium eradicator brush. I'm rubbing over it. The brush is wet. Paper's dry. I find it really easy to remove highlights or dry paint on Fabriano Artistico cold press paper, but on this soft press paper I find that the paper tends to hold on to the paint more, so I found it a little difficult to remove the paint once it had dried. And after I had done that, I was finished. If you've used the Fabriano soft press paper before, let me know in the comments what you think of it, because I'd love to know. The small eradicator brush that you saw me use to remove some paint, I've put a link to that brush in the description of this video as well. The full-length tutorial of this painting will be posted on my Patreon site next month. So if you want to learn more about painting in watercolour, please join us over there. I've put a link in the description. Thanks for watching. I'm always grateful when you hit the like button, and please subscribe to my channel if you don't already. And I'll be back after Easter. If you celebrate, I hope that you have a very happy Easter. I'll see you soon. For the past year or so, I've been trying to limit my palette as much as possible, and this week I painted a Rhinoceros. Yeah, one of these. And you don't have to worry about muddying your colours and created a disjointing painting. Yeah, you don't want to create a disjointing painting. Two colours that you will always find on my palette: burnt sienna and burnt sienna and French ultramarine. Because the tooth is only light, slight, I used two colours, French ultramarine and burnt sienna.